Hey, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
How you doing?
I'm all right. Sorry I had to skip out on you last week. I hope I hope I did not. I hope I wasn't a buzzkill.
Well, look, I'm concerned about the kids, who are out there, and they didn't get the DMZ last week. God knows, maybe they're on the streets. And so don't worry about me. Worry about them. But I think everyone muddled through. But this is good timing, Bill, because a big story dropped yesterday about the drone program. Now, there have been some people who've been very intellectually honest about this. Glenn Greenwald, Conor Friedersdorf, Kirsten Powers, among them. But mostly liberals have, and Conor's not a liberal, but the other two I think are, but mostly liberals, have sort of looked the other way. And if
I might question that classification of both those other people, actually. But
okay,
continue.
Well, I mean, what about Glenn Greenwald? I mean, do you think he's a liberal?
No, I think he's a civil libertarian. I think he regularly prioritizes those sorts of issues over other liberal issues.
Okay.
So I do not automatically assume he characterizes himself that way. Maybe he does, but I see him primarily as a civil libertarian, and therefore he is enraged over subjects like this.
Well, in any event, maybe that actually proves the point even more that liberals, in taping this on Wednesday, on Tuesday, on The Cycle, on MSNBC, you had two liberals, Touré, if I'm saying that correctly, and Crystal Ball, who has defended Obama's drone program, which, by the way, took out not only an American citizen, Al-Awlaki, but his 16-year-old son. And Touré especially, defended the president, saying that his commander-in-chief, that this is he's well within his rights to kind of unilaterally decide, his administration, if you count the DOJ, but to decide to take out an American without due process. But what's your take on this, Bill, generally? I mean, I think, okay, you are a liberal. What do you think? Is there hypocrisy here?
Well, I don't think there's hypocrisy. I think there are competing strains of liberalism, as there are competing strains of conservatism on a number of foreign policy questions. I think there is the civil libertarian side of liberalism that also comes up in the Rand Paul side of things on the right. But there's also been a side of liberalism, the Cold War liberals. Going back to Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and FDR. I mean, these are all folks who are all. I mean, Teddy was particularly aggressive militarily. Wilson was more of a pacifist at heart, but felt that there needed to be one last war to end all wars. So he wasn't a literal pacifist. FDR certainly felt it was necessary to mobilize to defend democracy and defeat fascism, and obviously Kennedy and LBJ were not pacifists. Clinton was not a pacifist. Obama's not a pacifist. So there's a long history of liberals saying to achieve liberal ends, there are times when military force is warranted.
Right. But let me just say, Bill, I'll stop you there, and I think you're totally right, and I would concede that. But the hypocrisy argument made by conservatives is that when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he, was very critical of Gitmo, of waterboarding, where you waterboarded, I think, 3 terrorists. Conversely, he's perfectly okay with killing an American without due process. And as bad as waterboarding might be, it's probably preferable to being evaporated from the sky. I mean, from being decimated. So I'll tell you, I wrote something at The Week that just went up that that argues that this is a new politically correct warfare, that Obama is giving us what we want, which is plausible deniability. Capturing people's messy, Interrogating them is messy. Having to see them, incarcerated, and having to put them through trials. It's messy, it's dirty, and it reminds us of something we don't even want to know about. So Obama is sort of doing us this, we have sort of this behind-the-scenes agreement with a wink and a nod, where he's just going to take out these people. We're not going to have to deal with the unseemly business of waterboarding. It's so barbaric. We'll just kill them, pull that Band-Aid off, one time. And in other words, we actually like this. The less we know, the better. Now, Bill, I make what I think, it's not entirely original to me. It was floating around yesterday. A lot of people have made this point. But I draw a similarity between this and abortion, where I don't want to compare the unborn to terrorists that we're killing, although the way that they're dispensed with isn't terribly different. But I think that if something is out of sight, it is out of mind. Dead men tell no tales, and that we are sort of complicit in this, that we like the fact that our problems, our inconveniences, are taken care of by the president. We have hired him to do a job, and we don't want to be troubled with the details of it. That's my take on why I think we get the president and the policy we really deserve.
Well, I agree with the last point. We don't typically elect pacifists to the job of commander-in-chief. It's just the fact that only Jimmy Carter is the only person who ever never really used the military in war. He did use them one time for that ill-fated rescue operation. But to the start of your point about hypocrisy, I don't think it's hypocritical. I mean, you can still criticize the drone policy. I'm not saying it's above criticism, but I don't think Obama's a hypocrite for saying he's against torture, against incarceration of people without due process, and for the drone program. You can make the argument that you shouldn't be because they all involve due process, but you could also make the argument that the circumstances for each are different, that Guantanamo cast an overly wide net in practice and ended up radicalizing people that shouldn't have been there in the first place. You could argue that torture is something that besmirches America's moral authority, and it violates treaties that we have signed, and therefore makes America itself to be a hypocrite because it's not following its own signature. And you could separate that from the drone program to say this is not all that different from a war setting. I mean, torture, the treaties that ban torture are supposed to apply to war. Those are the exceptions to war. Whereas in wars, people do get killed, and there are some people that are hard to capture. I don't think the White House has the strategy that they don't like capturing people. They don't like collecting intelligence.
But Bill, this isn't a conventional war where we go in there and drop bombs and you happen to hit somebody. I mean, these are surgical strikes. This is, you could say, assassination. I mean, this is
that's better. That's better than carpet. I mean, look, World War II, I think, had like 60 million dead. This is in many ways a whole lot better a system. It's more personal, and therefore it's more upsetting in some respects. And yet there is still collateral damage, including a 16-year-old American. Now, Bill, if George W. Bush, I hate to, this is so, I mean, I know this is hackneyed, but in this case, I think it's also actually relevant and legitimate. I mean, if George W. Bush had ordered a drone strike that killed an innocent 16-year-old American, I can't help but thinking it would have gotten a little bit more attention, and that he would have been forced to at least talk about it. And that hasn't happened. So, I mean, well, look, there was a lot of attention paid to, look, Abu Ghraib got a lot of attention.
Right, and I would argue it did. I would argue Abu Ghraib got more attention because there were pictures and there were people alive. If we had just killed the people at Abu Ghraib, swiftly, nobody would care because there wouldn't be pictures and there wouldn't be a public outcry and they wouldn't be talking to the ACLU or the Red Cross. They would have been out of sight, out of mind.
Well, so that's why I think all his attention was paid, and then Bush won. It's not like having the attention somehow changed the public opinion of the matter and made Bush lose.
He barely won, and I do think that contributed to his loss of credibility and popularity, and ultimately
he got more votes than the first time.
And ultimately to Obama's I think that it began to erode his sort of moral standing and his credibility. And it started off with the 2000 election, what happened in Florida, to be sure. Mm-hmm. But look, I want to go back to some stuff you talked about. You talked about due process. Well, look, you could make a mistake. You could theoretically make a mistake and capture somebody who's innocent and let them go. That's not going to happen if you drop a bomb on them or if a drone kills them. You talked about radicalization. It's drone strikes can radicalize. I'm sure they see it as cowardice and horrible that we are raining death from the sky, that we're taking out innocent civilians. I'm not convinced that drones aren't radicalizing and creating more terrorists than they're killing as well.
Well, I mean, these are the general arguments that I hear about parallels, and I hear folks on the Glenn Greenwald, quote-unquote, left and on the right attacking Obama supporters, saying, you're not following the same logic that you had during the Bush years on those exact points, on the backlash points. But it strikes me that the arguments we made today are wholly theoretical. I mean, yes, you could get that kind of backlash. I could see how that might happen, particularly if a program was executed so poorly that you were clearly killing people who were innocent. But I think in practice that has not happened. We have a better standing in the Middle East and the Arab world today than in the Bush years. We have less terrorism today than in the Bush years. There hasn't been a credible charge that someone killed by a drone under Obama was not an actual terrorist. We haven't had. So
what about the 16-year-old son? Who was an American citizen? And by the way, let me say, I think
most people feel like he was part of the team there. That wasn't just random collateral.
We'll never know that. I mean, we may never know that, and certainly he didn't have a trial. But look, I think there should so I think it's one thing to say that drones. I guess there's a couple issues. Number one, if we rely on drones too much, we may be depriving ourselves of intelligence information. And I know that capturing people and sort of housing them and is unseemly, and we don't like to do it, and you have to see them. But sometimes you can extract valuable information, possibly even information that might lead you to, I don't know, capture bin Laden eventually. So we may be depriving ourselves of that sort of intelligence because it's inconvenient. Putting that aside, I think we have to make a strong distinction between how we treat foreign-born terrorists and how we treat American citizens. Now, I was okay with killing Alaki, but I don't think it should be a decision unilaterally made via the administration. I would love to see some sort of formalized process where you bring in some key U.S. senators in a bipartisan way. I don't want it to get bogged down, but a couple of people in key committees who have to sign off on something like this. Because, look, the way we treat an American citizen who I think deserves certain constitutional rights ought to be different than the way that we treat, enemy combatants. So, again, Alaki, he was in Yemen. He was at war with America. I don't think it's a bad idea at all that we took him out. But I do think that the way that you go after an American citizen ought to be handled logistically, formally different than the way that you would go after a foreign-born terrorist.
I mean,
that's just me.
I mean, there are obviously perfectly set arguments you can make to that effect. I don't approach this argument, this debate, as it being a simple one. You obviously can easily make sort of the very morally pure argument that you should do things, by the constitutional book all the time, and it will end with a QED, and you'll feel good. Obviously, if it were just that simple, everyone would do it that way. I think that it is, to sort of counter Friedrich's point, who might say, obviously, I'm being more sympathetic to Obama's position here is, you could easily say, well, fine, you trust how Obama's doing it. Sure, Obama hasn't taken out an innocent, but you're crushing a lot of power into an individual executive with not a lot of check on it, and maybe the next guy is going to be more like a Bush, and you're not going to like how he does it. And
that's why we have the rule of law, by the way.
Well, that goes to another part of my point here. The Constitution does still exist. If someone has the standing, and Al-Awlaki's family does have the standing, I think they might even be pursuing legal recourse. I know there was some talk about that earlier. You can sue the president for violating the Constitution. The court system allows you to do that. So Bush's practices were reined in by the Supreme Court because they were found to violate the Constitution. So it's not just
if the president does it, it's not a crime.
What's that?
Wasn't that line from Frost Nixon? If the president does it, it's not a crime.
No, but that's not true. The Supreme Court can call it a crime. The Supreme Court can say you're unconstitutional. And if someone wants to cobble a legal case together to say the German program is unconstitutional, they are perfectly able to do that. And I'm sure some folks are trying to do that. I don't think the president should be unchecked at all on the subject.
I just say my last point about this is to reiterate what I said before, which is that I think Obama is giving us the warfare that we want, which is I don't think America has the stomach for pictures coming back of or people who are alive being incarcerated or tortured, or whatever you want to call it. I think that we're much more comfortable just killing them, which I think, because somehow killing somebody is more sophisticated and extracting information is more barbaric. I think this goes
back to. Sorry, finish your point.
Well, I think that Obama. I don't blame Obama. I think he is giving America what we want.
Well, and I don't think this is due to Obama. I think Bush Sr. With the first Gulf War was executed in a way to fit American appetites. Crush the enemy quickly. Don't let the pictures
for destruction. Happy birthday, Axl Rose.
don't let the pictures come. Tightly control the pictures that get shown. You don't have to see the carnage. You don't have to wake up to the degree of casualties. Very few American casualties. Rumsfeld under Bush, I think further sophisticated that. He was even arguing for a smaller military because technologically speaking, you didn't need it to achieve your ends. And if people don't have to get drafted for these major wars and the families aren't affected, then it's easier to execute them. People want to get Bush won after Abu Ghraib because I would think primarily because people were comfortable with his prosecution of the war effort than they thought they would be with John Kerry. I don't think that was a negative for Obama in 2004. It became a negative in 2006 because people thought the war wasn't going well. But that wasn't because of the torture stuff. That's because we were still there and people were dying and they didn't seem like it was going to end anytime soon. So I think as a general matter, Americans are very happy to have wars occur out of sight, out of mind. So I don't think it's new under Obama. What's different is that this is even more surgical and more narrow with fewer casualties than what had been going on before. So that's why if I seem perhaps a little conflicted or perhaps not overly aggressive in my defense of Obama years, because one, I think the issues are profoundly complicated and imperfect, but I also balance the moral ambiguity there with the historical perspective, which is, as far as presidents and war go, this is very light on the casualty count. I mean, geez, there were over, I think 150 million people dead between 1900 and 1950, with both world wars combined. So we are drastically reducing the amount of war casualties we are suffering, and so I can't hold Obama to the standard of absolute perfection here. When the world has never been that perfect, but I think that hopefully I agree that the Supreme Court has a role to play here. I don't think Obama has unfettered unitary executive authority on this matter. So wants to challenge the authority that he has. I think they're welcome to do so. But I think there are a handful of cases that are very, very, very hard to deal with, and I can't fault the guy for trying to handle it in this way when the people having the complaints, I don't think have an obvious alternative. You can say you should capture them. Yes, I agree. If you can capture them, great. I would not want to see a situation where they were.
Well, I'd like to see I'd like to see some sort of sign off from somebody other than the administration when you're going to kill an American. That's one change I would like to see. I think it's a modest proposal, but
well, I mean,
anyway, Bill,
we'll move on from the point. But it's a tough issue. Now you've read some other interesting things this week about the state of conservatism.
Well, let's shift from the war abroad to the war at home, and more specifically, the war between conservatives, including outside groups like the Club for Growth, versus Karl Rove and establishment Republicans who want to avoid the next Todd Aiken. Before I get into it, Bill, you've seen this sort of thing happen on the left. What is your take on
it? The sort of thing as far as trying to prevent.
Right. So you guys had people. Right. Well, you had people like Howard Dean and some candidates on the left that some people viewed as fringy, and then there's this argument as to whether or not that's helpful to the cause. I mean, Karl Rove is basically threatening to, started this new group that is basically threatening to target conservative candidates that they deem to be unacceptable, whether too conservative or not, eloquent enough, whatever the case. Is this good or bad?
I don't think the left has. I don't think the left has had an issue with this in the way that the right has had for maybe ever. I can't think of examples.
Go clean with Gene. Go clean with Gene.
Well, there's always been liberal candidates, but look, Gene McCarthy didn't get the nomination. Howard Dean didn't get the nomination. Dan Kucinich didn't get the nomination. I think there's been more self-patrolling.
At the presidential level, Republicans have nominated Mitt Romney too. It's not like they nominated Michelle Obama.
I mean, it's also true that you don't see these guys win in the presidential primaries. But the issue has been, going back to 2010, that there are a number of Senate races in particular that were much better prospects for Republican pickups or Republican protection if the Tea Party style candidate was not nominated. Then there are more reasonable, softer edge choices available to the primary electorate. But the hard right dominated the primary process, and that candidate sunk the race.
Right.
I can't think of examples on the left like that.
Well, I think that I guess I could go into that, but let me just focus on the right, since I'll concede that point and focus. I'll just focus on what I think the deal is. My concern with Karl Rove, and I'm not convinced that this is sincere. I'm not convinced this isn't just an effort to raise money and to sort of rehabilitate his image after what happened, all the losses he suffered this election, including his stunt on Fox News, not buying that the Ohio results were correct or were in yet. But anyway, so here's the concern. First of all, who decides which candidates are good? Now, I think I could, but that's. But I think that's also sort of a dangerous conceit for us to believe that we could fix things. I mean, I think I could tell the difference between Marco Rubio and Sharon Angle, between, Marco Rubio and Christine O'Donnell. But what about Rand Paul? I mean, you could have, he ran against Mitch McConnell's chosen candidate in Kentucky and won, and I think Rand Paul has been a fairly successful and important senator. What about Pat Toomey? He ran against Arlen Specter. So I think there is sort of a free market in elections, and how do you could have easily said that Charlie Crist, a very popular at the time sitting governor of Florida, would have been a much more compelling candidate than Marco Rubio. In Texas, Dewhurst, the lieutenant governor, might have been the guy that you picked. So I think there's a danger in the meddling, where you have an establishment types meddling, sort of saying, well, these guys, they can win. I mean, Charlie Crist seemed like an easier win. I mean, so I think there's that problem. But I'll tell you what my solution is, Bill, because I don't think it's about ideology. I think it's about sophistication and communications ability. And I really wish, rather than taking this adversarial approach, rather than going up against groups like the Club for Growth and Freedom Works and Americans for Prosperity or whatever, I wish that Rove had been a uniter, not a divider. And here's what I think, assuming that you can legally do this, and I know there are probably some FEC loopholes, but what I would like to see, before groups endorse candidates and before they give them money, they have to fill out pledges, and they have to go through interviews where they, are grilled, and they have to show that they're philosophically conservative. It's not just enough to say you're for lower taxes. You have to sort of know who Hayek is, right? Why not incorporate into that mechanism where you're deciding whom to support, whom to finance, competence? And I think you should require some sort of campaign training. I worked at the Leadership Institute for 4 years. They have a TV studio there where you can practice going on mock TV interviews and make your mistakes there so you don't say stupid things on TV. Now, we still do, of course, but you're less likely to if you've been trained. Why not make that a requirement? I would love if Karl Rove, before his group decides to target a conservative running for the U.S. Senate and try to defeat them in the primary and spend millions and millions of dollars, why not offer, hey, look, here's how you can get out of this, here's how you can avoid us going after you. Come spend a week, bring your family, bring your campaign manager, and go through our communications training. If you pass, we're hands off. We're not going to get involved. I would love to see that. That would be a very constructive thing they could do, and I think it solves the problem.
Does it already happen?
Well,
there are training programs already in effect on the right?
There are training programs that exist that groups like the Leadership Institute and GOPAC and other organizations offer. Certainly, committees like the NRCC and the NRSC offer training once you become the nominee, typically, after you become the nominee. And the training is part training, part indoctrination. And it's typically not great, to be honest with you. So it sort of happens. But here's what doesn't happen. And by the way, you can sort of come and just check off the boxes and say you've been there. But what doesn't happen is it's not a condition of receiving money. Again, you would have to obviously comply with electoral law. But I'm sure there's a way to do this, to say, look, our policy is we will give your campaign money, or we will not give, if you take training, communications training, and convince us. Because if we're making an investment, when we spend millions of dollars to elect, to nominate, say, a Todd Akin. Now, by the way, let's make a point here. Todd Akin, the most famous example, was not endorsed by the Club for Growth, nor was he the Tea Party candidate. It's very important to point that out. And let me also make the point that the so-called great establishment candidates, like Linda Lingle, like Tommy Thompson, like Rick Berg, who's actually a good guy, but sort of a moderate establishment guy in North Dakota, a lot of these establishment candidates, the dream candidates that Republican, insiders wanted, they lost too. And I don't think they just lost because of the toxic environment that Todd Akin created. But having said that, the problem with Akin and Murdoch isn't, in my opinion, that they're extremists. It's that they were not very eloquent in presenting their pro-life points of view. If you believe that, and you may or may not, then I think training is the answer.
Well, but you're saying it's not really an ideological divide here, but from the Rove standpoint, it might be. He might be saying it's not good for the party to have people with an absolutist view on abortion, with an absolutist view on immigration. We need people with different positions for the party to be seen as a majority party again. And perhaps even more meta than that, and it's sort of an establishment way of thinking, they may be saying, we need people who are going to be flexible and coachable, who when our political experts tell them, look, you got to take a bullet on this one, they'll take the bullet and not be completely resistant to team play.
Right.
And it's possible that they look at an Aiken and a Murdoch and an O'Donnell and a Joe Miller and a Ken Buck and say, like, these guys are never going to do in the whatever future obstacle presents itself to becoming a majority party again. These guys won't bend ever, and we can't have that. If that's
a good
the divide.
point. That's a good point, Bill. And when some of these Republican candidates were ousted from committees a few months ago, I forget who, but some leader, some Republican leader said it wasn't because of their ideas, it was because they were a-holes, but he didn't say it like that. And I think that's a good point. I mean, there was a sort of rock the boat, rebellious, in-your-face thing that we went through with the Tea Party that was more, it's not, look, I've always thought that you can vote however you want. If I were a conservative congressman, if I were elected to Congress, I would do the following. I would raise a lot of money and I would pay my dues to the committees. They have to, the NRCC, the NRSC, you pay them dues so you can use their offices. And they use it to help elect other Republicans and sometimes conservatives and sometimes moderates. I would pay my dues. I would pay more than my dues. I would support Republicans all over the country if I were a Republican congressman. And I would be very nice to leadership, and then I would vote however I wanted. But I wouldn't string them on. I think that if you do it the right way, if you don't publicly, I wouldn't go out there and bash my speaker or my leader publicly. I would vote against them when I think they're wrong. But I think you could have a perfect voting record, that would get like a 99% or something from Heritage Action or the Club for Growth, whatever, and still get along just fine. So I do think that some of it is attitude. But look, I think you can weed them out during the training. If people won't do the training, then I think that tells you all you need to know about their attitude.
Well, I think the kind of relationship you describe, I think the Democratic Party and the left have that. The Congressional Progressive Caucus doesn't always, vote exactly how leadership wants them to, but usually in crunch time they do. They tend not to completely upset the apple cart when their votes are really needed. And this is actually chafes on some of the folks on the outside left that the Progressive Caucus doesn't cause more trouble. Why won't we be more like the right and be the squeaky wheel and force the debate over to our side? There have been some early attempts to replicate the Club for Growth strategy and back primary challengers, and PCCC, Progressive Change Campaign Committee, has sort of been at the forefront of that. But they've been very selective in the targets, probably for lack of resources. The first time this was out before PCCC was in existence was when they went after Joe Lieberman in 2006, and there was a big sort of Netroots effort that was more loose, but they backed Ned Lamont, ousted him in the primary, and then Lieberman got the last laugh in the general. But a lot of the left took that as a moral victory. We got him out of the party, so he may still be in the Senate, but we showed that he's not a real Democrat. That's going to undercut his moral standing.
On the right, though, I think Well, I think, Bill, I think you're right, but on the right, I mean, my problem is it's presented as if Dement and the Club for Growth have contributed to all these rubes. I mean, Marco Rubio, Mike Lee, Tim Scott, there's Ron Johnson. I mean, you've got these candidates who are smart, qualified, experienced. I mean, you can't tell me that the U.S. Senate would be more functional or that the conservative movement would be better off if Charlie Crist and Bennett were there instead. I mean,
I mean, the Rose of the world are mad at the Club for Growth about those races. They're mad about Christine O'Donnell and Murdoch and Aiken and Joe Miller and Ken Buck. I don't think they're. I think they're saying we don't want Club for Growth to exist. We want them to be more strategic. And when PCCC and some of the labor groups got behind the effort to oust Blanche Lincoln in Arkansas for Bill Halter, and that primary effort failed, but they wounded Lincoln well enough that she got trounced in the general. Now, a lot of the attitude from those opposing her said, well, she was dead meat anyway, so it's not our fault that happened, and she was no use for us being there. So that was a low risk operation.
The problem I have with
I'm sure some of the establishment folks said that's not true. You made her life a lot more miserable, and maybe she could have kept the seat if you guys laid off. It's Arkansas, for Pete's sake. You're not going to get perfection from the left in Arkansas.
The problem I have with the strategic is you could have made a really good argument that that Charlie Crist and very popular at the time, governor of Florida, was a much safer bet. He made a very strong argument that I think it was Trey Grayson or whomever was much better than Ron Paul's son. Come on, Ron Paul's son in a general election. So I mean, who decides? The knowledge problem, as they say. But look, I will concede this point. When conservative outside groups decide whom they're going to support, I wish that now they certainly have every right to have a litmus test, an ideological litmus test, right? They fill out these pledges and they interview them. But I wish they would also factor in competence and these other sort of intangibles. How they're going to play. Sanity might be nice. Competence might, So I will concede that I think I could tell the difference between Marco Rubio, who was Speaker of the House in Florida, versus Christine O'Donnell, who sued a conservative organization and, as far as I know, never held any elected office. I think I could distinguish between the two. But look, Sharon Angle was in the Nevada State House, and I think I could distinguish between the two just in terms of temperament, in terms of communications ability. But how do you quantify that? It's not as clear cut. So, who decides is the problem.
It's just like the drone program.
Yes, the two are exactly alike, Bill. You want to end it there, or do you want to keep going? All right.
We can talk for an appropriate comment.
We could talk more, but why? Why improve upon perfection? Let me give a quick plug. If you're wondering what the poster behind me is, it's Vicopia, a proud sponsor of my podcast, the Matt Lewis and the News podcast. And it's cool. It's a combination e-reader and social network. So, Bill, you and I could read a book together online, and we can make notes, and I could see your notes in the margin. You can see mine. We should do that.
We should.
What do you want to plug? You should plug something, Bill. Tell us about House Liberal Oasis.
Yeah,
let me just say real quick. Your guy over there who also has a show. Help me out with his name. Interviewed David Schuster. A very interesting interview with David Schuster the other day about his time at Fox News. That's
right. No, David Packman.
Right.
And David Packman is working with Schuster's new radio program, Take Action News, helping him with his YouTube presence. And Packman helps me with my YouTube presence. So there's a little DavidPackman.com media empire brewing here. But yeah, for those who don't know Schuster or wondering where he's going after Current, he's now doing his own gig, Take Action News. And forgive me for not having the URL at the ready. I can try to dig it up here.
Well, let me just say it was a very good interview, and Schuster talked about his time working at Fox News. He was there for, I think, 6 years, and he calls out Brett Baer, so check it out. And he also talks about his time at MSNBC and concedes that both networks go into their respective corners over time.
So takeactionnews.com, that's where you can find his show. All right. Well, till next week, Mr. Lewis.
All right. Another award-winning show. So oh, by the way, congratulations, Bill. You were right about the Super Bowl. I should say that. You were right. I was wrong, and I told you you'd be right, and you were. The Ravens won. So
always trust the guy who doesn't actually follow the game.
All right, man. Catch you next week.
Take care.